Hello everyone, this lesson is all about Elizabeth I, and it focuses on the succession crisis which went on in England pretty much throughout the whole duration of Elizabeth's rule. So, when Elizabeth became the Queen of England in 1558, she was 25 years old, she was unmarried and there was no obvious heir to the throne, which is the person that takes over next. Now, some questions here for you to think about. This is going to be a problem. Remember that Henry VIII spent a lot of his time when he was the King of England looking for a male heir and, looking to produce a male heir. And he felt that he needed a male heir in order to keep the Tudor, what he called dynasty, going. So the fact that Elizabeth had no heir was a problem because it meant that if Elizabeth died, there would be no one to take over the throne when she died, or at least it wouldn't be obvious who would take over the throne when she died, and that could potentially lead to conflict and instability in the country. However, Elizabeth was reluctant to name an heir because as soon as she did name an heir, then people would be able to focus on that heir for opposing Elizabeth, for example. So particularly if people didn't like what Elizabeth was doing with religion, they might try and gather support around an heir. So it was a very, very difficult, tricky balance for Elizabeth to have. Now, this could obviously be solved if Elizabeth got married and had children, and that would create natural heirs, and that's kind of how this worked. But at 25, Elizabeth was unmarried and had no heir to the throne, and she wasn't married at that time. And actually, comparatively speaking, 25 in those days was fairly old not to be married during that time period. So we're going to find out about the succession crisis and how this resolved by the end of her rule in the year 1603. So this just shows us the topics that we've done. So we've looked at the background and character of Elizabeth. We looked at the early problems of her reign. We've looked at the court and government of Elizabeth I. We've found out about her parliament. So we're going to then look at succession crisis. And then in our other lessons this week, we're going to look at the end of Elizabeth's reign and how secure she was at the end of her reign. So this shows us what we're going to do in this lesson. We're going to think about the significance of the succession crisis, understand it, think about its significance in terms of Elizabeth's power. And we're going to think, first of all, about who could Elizabeth have married, and then we're going to look at how the succession crisis eventually did resolve itself, so that actually when she died in 1603, the succession went to James, King James VI of Scotland as he was, became King James I of England, actually resolved itself quite smoothly. For all that people had worried about it during Elizabeth's reign, it actually did resolve quite smoothly, and power was transferred in a very straightforward manner at the end of Elizabeth's rule when she died in 1603. So, first thing to think about is this is a work produced by John Knox, who was a leading Protestant at the time. And we'll just look at this source, and it tells us about attitudes towards women in the 16th century, particularly about women ruling. And he said, to promote a woman to bear rule, superiority, dominion, or empire above any realm, nation, or city is repugnant, which means against, repugnant to nature, an insult to God, a thing most contrary to his revealed will and approved ordinance. And finally, it is the subversion of good order, of all equity and justice. God, by the order of his creation, deprived women of authority and dominion, for their sight is but blindness, their strength weakness, their counsel foolishness, and their judgment frenzy. Now, this kind of attitude really angered Elizabeth at the time. And it shows that there was a real feeling, we discussed this when we looked at the problems of Elizabeth, that women should not be allowed to rule and were not capable of ruling. And we know that Elizabeth, in her 45-year rule, showed that she was one of England's greatest ever monarchs, and she was absolutely up to the challenge of ruling England, and she was a very, very strong monarch that led England into fantastic victories. But this was the kind of battle that she had to contend with. And in fact, one of the reasons why Elizabeth didn't marry was that she knew that if she did get married, then that would actually reduce her power, and that people would look to her husband to rule the country, and she wouldn't have as much control and power. So one of the reasons why Elizabeth remained unmarried, she was known as the Virgin Queen, was that she wanted to keep that grip on power herself. So many people expected Elizabeth to get married, and this was because they felt that it would resolve the succession crisis, so that people would know who was going to come next. Obviously, that attitude that women couldn't rule effectively, and therefore she needed a husband to help her run the country. And particularly in her early years, the Privy Council and Parliament both tried to pressure on Elizabeth to marry or name an heir. But in the end, she actually angrily banned Parliament from even discussing the succession crisis and her marriage. So there are arguments for and against whether Elizabeth I should have married, and there are arguments obviously in favour of marriage. It could have created a foreign alliance, and England needed allies at that time. It would have produced an heir to the throne. But the arguments against marriage, and probably things that swayed her, was if she did get married, she would lose her authority, especially if she married a foreign ruler. That would give then that foreign ruler quite a lot of control over England. And remember, her sister, Queen Mary, had been married to Philip of Spain. So that hadn't really given her the best example of how a marriage to a foreign leader could work. Giving birth was also be quite risky for her health. Childbirth was quite risky at the time for women, so that's something that Elizabeth would have thought of. And also, she was able to use the possibility of her marriage as a way to kind of deal with foreign leaders and other important figures in England. If she'd married an Englishman as well, that could have created tensions between people within England and some of the main noble families in England at the time. So Elizabeth, in the end, decided that it probably was best for her not to get. So who could she have married? Well, she did receive in her early time as the monarch some marriage proposals. Foreign rulers like King Philip of Spain, who'd been married to her sister Mary, Archduke Charles of Austria, King Eric of Sweden, but all of these were rejected. I mean, there was actually quite a lot of protracted negotiations about her marrying King Eric of Sweden, but in the end, the alliance, the marriage, did not happen. So, leading contenders for Elizabeth to marry, Francis, Duke of Anjou and Alençon, the brother of the French king at the time. But Elizabeth was quite old when that marriage proposal was actually proposed and wouldn't have been able to have children, and therefore, having a childless marriage could have resulted in England falling under the influence of French control, France being a Catholic country at the time. The fact that he was Catholic as well meant that many people within Elizabeth's court were against that marriage. She could have married King Philip of Spain. After all, he'd been married to her sister Mary, but she decided not to. And he'd rarely visited England during the marriage to Mary, and it hadn't gone particularly well. And of course, he was a Catholic as well, so that would have thrown into chaos her religious. And then, looking closer to home, she could have married Robert Dudley, who was the Earl of Leicester. Now, he was a friend of Elizabeth's, and there were rumours of a romance between the two. He was certainly a favourite of Elizabeth's, and it did seem likely at one time that they would get married. However, the problem with Robert Dudley was that he was already married. And then his wife, Amy, ended up dying in suspicious circumstances. She was actually found at the foot of a staircase. That enabled Robert Dudley, the Earl of Leicester, to be free to marry Elizabeth. But there were rumours that both he and Elizabeth might have been involved in Amy being found at the foot of some stairs, that it might have been kind of like a murder plot. And that made it very, very difficult for him to marry Elizabeth. So they never did get married in the end. But obviously, Robert Dudley was a leading member of the Privy Council. So by the 1570s, into her rule, it seemed unlikely that Elizabeth was going to get married. She was in her mid-40s, unlikely to have children. But Elizabeth refused again and again and again to name any kind of successor. And that was because she was worried they could be the focus of plots. So people were kind of resigned to the idea that Elizabeth wasn't going to get married. So a lot of attention then turned to the fact that, well, who was Elizabeth going to name as her heir? And one of the interesting things, actually, I didn't say, was that in the 1560s and 1562, Elizabeth got ill with smallpox and almost died. And I think this, again, showed and reinforced to people how important it was for England to have an heir during that time. But Elizabeth, being quite stubborn, she used to name an heir. It was difficult for Elizabeth to find a suitable husband and therefore create a suitable heir. Because obviously if she chose a member of the English nobility, that could create divisions. Choosing a foreign leader, that would mean that there would be quite a lot of foreign influence in England. If she married a Catholic, that would create Catholic influence in England. So in the end, Elizabeth not to marry. And there's a little bit of a source focus that you can just have a little look at there to help you to understand Elizabeth. You've got to remember her mother, Anne Boleyn, was beheaded by Henry VIII, so she probably didn't have the best kind of personal experience of marriage, with her father having had 6 wives, so maybe she felt it was better to stay independent and married. So this led to obviously a succession crisis. I've talked about the fact that Elizabeth had contracted smallpox, so Elizabeth by the 1560s, 1570s, 1580s, she's got no children. There's no heir. This comes in England at the time. And really to understand this, and we'll return to this topic in a bit more detail, we'll look at Mary Queen of Scots in more detail, but there are essentially two main claims to the throne. There's what's called the Stuart Claim, which is all through Henry VIII's sister Margaret, who you can see here. So those people that claim the throne, one of the key people there was Mary Queen of Scots. And you can see that in the end, it does go through the Stuart Claim to bring about the next monarch of England, because the throne does pass in the end to Mary Queen of Scots' son, who's called James VI of Scotland. He becomes King James I of England. He's the one who's the father of Charles I, who's King of England that gets beheaded. And then the other claim is called the Suffolk Claim, and that goes through Henry VIII's other sister, Mary. And you can see here, that's the side where we've got Lady Jane Grey on, for example. There's the two Greys there, Catherine Grey and Mary Grey as well. So that's the two different claims to be aware of. That just gives you a bit of information about the Suffolk Claim and the two Grey sisters. So you can just pause that and have a little look at what the Suffolk Claim is. Probably more famous claim is the Stuart Claim, which is from Mary Queen of Scots, who's a key figure during this time, quite a controversial figure, which we'll look at in a bit more detail when we find out about Mary Queen of Scots. In a nutshell, Mary Queen of Scots, in the end, Elizabeth has her executed in the 1580s, and that's resolved. But we'll look at Mary Queen of Scots in a bit more detail in future lessons. All right. So this just shows you how the succession was ended. In the end, arrangements were made by Robert Cecil, who was a key member of the Privy Council by the early 1600s. That's William Cecil's son. And they come up with arrangements really to get the throne to be passed to her cousin, Elizabeth's cousin, James VI of Scotland. And in the end, that passing of the throne goes. So that's how it all resolves. Okay, we can see there, just show you that family tree again. The throne passes to James VI of Scotland, so it goes through what's called the Stuart line. Okay, and that's all really organised in the years up to Elizabeth's death. So, to conclude what we learned about in this lesson, the key points: Elizabeth I, despite many offers of marriage and rumours that she might marry someone like Philip of Spain, for example, or Robert Dudley, the Earl of Leicester, decided not to marry to keep her power and independence. She refused to name an heir because she was worried that there would be a focus of plots around this heir. Two main claims to the throne were through Henry VIII's sisters Mary and Margaret, the Stuart and the Suffolk claim. Mary Queen of Scots was seen as a person who could succeed the throne but was executed in 1587. In the end, Robert Cecil arranged for King James VI of Scotland to become the next King of England, and in the end, the transition in 1603 was remarkably smooth. Thanks very much for listening. I hope you enjoyed that. Goodbye.